When you hear the word minor or major, some instant things come to your mind. When you think of major, it's something very important. Minor is not near as important. We say things like, well, he's going to have minor surgery, or they had a minor accident, or there's a minor problem. There's been a minor injury. It's my minor in college. They're in the minor leagues. And so immediately when we think of those things, somehow we elevate major above minor and think it's not as important. And because of this, and maybe because of the names and how hard they are pronounced, some of them, the minor prophets, that group of books in the Old Testament called the minor prophets, have been overlooked by the majority of Christians. I don't want you to give yourself away, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but for some of us, maybe a lot of us, we've never even read these books because they have a name like minor, or they have a name like Habakkuk, that we just haven't paid any attention to. But they're called minor because of the length of the writing, not the importance of it. You should like it. It's a short read, that we can read these books. They were mostly written about Israel, or after Israel had already turned its back on God and become a very wayward nation. The major theme of these books, these minor prophets, is how God is going to bring his people back together someday. And he spends a great deal of time through all these books talking about the result of sin and how bad sin has been, how destructive it's been to this nation, because that's the truth. Sin is destructive to an individual. It causes pain and destruction in a family, to a nation, to a church when there's sin involved. I titled this series Minor, but I really thought about titling it The Gospel in the Old Testament, because these writings and the minor prophets just point right to Jesus. It's all about the redemption of people. It's all about a God who loves people during the most unfaithful times of their lives. So if you want to know how to put your life back together after sin has wrecked it, if you want to know and get hope for how to pursue restoring a relationship with someone after your actions have been what destroyed it, then these books are for you. This is reading for you. Hosea is the first of the minor prophets. Now, we're going to spend all of our time there, and if you start looking for it now, you may have it by the time I'm halfway through the sermon. So go ahead, if you want to follow along in your Bibles, go ahead and look up Hosea there in the Old Testament. You use the pews on the back of the pew in front of you. It's going to be on the screen as well. But Hosea is the first of the 12. It is a bizarre story. The first time you read the story of Hosea, I just wish sometimes I could go back and forget it all and then read it for the very first time. Because the first time you read it, you go, are you kidding me? Are you serious? You're asking this man to do this? God is going to do this? But I think even after you've read it 100 times, you still cannot get over the shock of this story. I think scandalous is one of the best words to describe the book of Hosea. The story of Hosea is scandalous. The definition for scandalous is offensive to a sense of decency and shocking to, shameful. And it doesn't take long into this story to see why I would say this story is scandalous. Hosea chapter 1 verse 2 says this: When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, Go take to yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery and departing from the Lord. Now, there's all kinds of things you can read in commentaries and scholars and all, but the root word here, that's talking about go and take yourself an adulterous wife, can mean adulterous, unfaithful, can even mean prostitute. To go and find this kind of woman. Can you imagine when all the prophets were in school and it was graduation day and they were passing out the assignments? Said, okay, you're going to Jerusalem. You're going here. Hosea, you're going to marry a prostitute. You know, can you imagine? But that's how this is. You know, that he is told to do this. This, and all the prophets have always got some strange assignments, tough assignments. They had to go to preach to people that tried to kill them and did kill them, threw them in prison, ignored them, tortured them, sent them to places where they got swallowed by a big fish. But here's one of the strangest and maybe the toughest. In the best case scenario, you're going to be marrying a woman who is unfaithful to you, and the children you have, you won't even know if they're really yours or not. The worst case scenario is that she is actually prostituting herself out while she's your wife. But God reveals right off the bat why he's asking Hosea to do this. He says, I want you to illustrate to Israel what they're doing to me, but how I'm going to love them back. Adultery is unfaithfulness, but I don't want us to just fixate on that one element of unfaithfulness. The Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, uses that as an illustration of unfaithfulness. And I'm not making light of it, but do not fixate on just that one element of unfaithfulness. We want to look at all the areas that. In this story, we're going to see that it's not just a wife's unfaithfulness, but Israel's unfaithfulness to God by turning to other things and other nations rather than turning to God. Israel turned to other nations for their protection, for their help, their security, their pleasure. And those don't sound like bad things, but they were a sin in God's eyes because he said, I'm your God. You come to me. You don't go to the false gods of another nation. Let me ask you, where do you turn when you're worried? Where do you turn when you're unsure of the future and you're worried about the future? Who do you turn to when you're stressed out, when you're stressed about the future? So when you fear that you may never have a husband or a wife if you don't go along with the things of the day, and so you sleep together before marriage, or you move in together, even though you were raised and read the Bible and know that that's not the direction that God set it up. You see, the primary sin is not that there's was sex before marriage. The sin is you didn't trust God with your future. You didn't trust him enough to follow it the way he said it. When you turn to alcohol or drugs or pornography or shopping or screaming and yelling to get along with stressful times, the primary sin is not the alcohol or the drugs or the shopping or the screaming. The sin is that you've turned to something else other than God to get through the day, to make it through tough times. When you refuse to give your time or give your money to God, the sin is not that you withheld 10%. God doesn't need your or my money. He doesn't need our time. But the sin is that we have replaced God. We have turned to other things so much that we miss 12, 14, 16, 18, 24 Sundays out of a year because we have filled it up with other things that will bring us pleasure. And we say to God, I find pleasure in these places other than being here on a Sunday to be with you. God tells Hosea, he says, I not only want you to tell the people this, I want you to show them this. Look at Hosea 1:3. So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. You'll notice here it says, bore him a son. So scholars say this child looks like it probably was his. Now, I'm not even going to mention this woman's name. She has enough problems as it is. I'm not even going to bring up her name. It just wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be right to rub it in to Hosea what her name is, what his wife's name is. So I'm not even going to go there. Not even going to talk about it. But you see, he didn't just obey God and take her as his wife. He married her, and he loves her, and he tries to start a family. He tries to do everything as normal as possible. and they have children together. Now, what you are going to get from me today is a real overview. And we're going to see some of the highlights of this story, but I'm telling you, this is one of the greatest reads. Even the way that they named their children, that God told them, this is what I want you to name your son, this is what I want you to name your, has something to do with the story. So it's great, great reading. You should really read it to get the full picture of everything. Look at verse, like I said, and we're kind of skipping and moving fast. Look at Hosea 2:5. She said, I will go after my lovers who give me my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my oil and my drink. She leaves Hosea and seeks love and fulfillment and pleasure and comfort and material things that apparently he cannot provide. And eventually, and we're going to see here very shortly, that eventually the lovers that she has, they tire of her. And they're ready to just throw her back. Now we'll look and see what happens now. Skip to Hosea 3:1. The Lord said to me, go show your love to your wife again. Though she is loved by another and is an adulteress, love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. You know, sometimes there are words or a word or a phrase that's probably the least important in the whole thing, but it grabs our attention. It's kind of like the elephant in the room. So what in the world are raisin cakes? You know, does he have something against Little Debbie? You know, and what this is, and it shows up several times through the Old Testament. The people considered raisin cakes, something like that, a real delicacy. And if you had something like that, it must mean that the gods are blessing you. So when they had these things, they gave all the credit to the Baals, to the false gods. Oh, look how much he loves us. That he's providing our land. Our land produces things like this. So that's what it's about here. It says the sacred raisin cakes. Please do not forget, in the midst of all of this, and what God is trying to prove and teach Israel and teach us, is that Hosea was a real person. He's a real person with feelings and emotions. And he had to think of it at times, I've got one life to live. And this is what I have to live. Now, don't forget that. This is a very public unfaithfulness with multiple partners, as we're going to see. And you're going to see later that she was even selling herself to others. Let's be real honest. How many of us would take back someone like that? How many of us would take back someone like that if they came crawling to us, begging and pleading, confessing how wrong they were? How many of us would condemn Hosea for not taking her back? Most likely, we would condemn Hosea for taking her back. But God says, you go to her. You go to her and try to bring her back. It says, love her as I have loved Israel. And that's God's message. That's what he's trying so hard to get a point across here. Now, I want us to point out just quickly some things that we need to meditate on. Maybe you didn't need to hear this story. Maybe you've heard the story of Hosea 100 times. And you could get right up here and tell the story of Hosea and Gomer. But maybe there's somebody here just needs to be reminded of what great lengths God goes to love us. First one is this, that God's love is scandalous. As I said before, any of us in Hosea's position would have thought he was crazy for doing this. And let me tell you, the people that were surrounded him thought Hosea was crazy. They thought it was shameful what he was doing, that he would do this type of thing. This, like I say, we're going to see how bad this is. You know, in times like this, we look for loopholes, don't we? When we're locked in a situation, we look for a way to get out of it but still be a good person, to not be condemned or criticized. And we look for a loophole. God had loopholes. If you go back and read the Old Testament law about something like this, God has said if your wife, your husband does something like this, you do not have to take them back. You don't have to put up with something like this. God went beyond his own laws to welcome Israel back. Have you ever thought about that? God did not look for a loophole. He went beyond what he had written. You know, people criticize God and give him a bad name and a bad rap in our culture today and say, oh, God is so judgmental. How could he be so judgmental? How could he put these things on us? If you want to criticize God for anything, I think we need to criticize him for loving us too much and being way too patient with us. When you see the lengths that he'd go to and the patience he'll show to us. Look at Hosea 11:8. That's a big skip down over there. 11:8. This is God speaking, and it's right after he's talked about all of the destruction that sin would bring on Israel and all the bad times. He says this, but how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zebulun? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. God is saying, I know I have the right. I know that no one could criticize me for wiping you off the face of the earth, turning my back on you. Like some of these other places, and he names them that led to destruction. He says, but how can I do it? He says, my emotions, my heart is ripped open for you. You see, God doesn't have to have us. He can carry on well without us. But he has united his heart with us. He has so tied us into what he wants for us that we are united by his heart. By his free choice, he has wrapped his happiness up in ours. I love this illustration. A couple who does not have children yet, it's not that they're unhappy. But when they choose to have children or choose to adopt a child, when that happens, they make the decision to tie their happiness, to bind their happiness to those children. Isn't that beautiful? And isn't that how it is? And God has chosen to bind himself to us. That's how much God loves us. That's why I say it's scandalous that he would go so far to do this, that he would be criticized, that he would be looked down upon for reaching out to us like this. The second thing we need to carry from this is that God purchased us. That title doesn't even give it justice, but I can't come up with a better word. This is hard to believe. When we read this next verse, it's obvious that Gomer was involved in either being a temple prostitute or a prostitute. And her pimp, the person who owns her, is now tired of her. But Hosea wants to save her. Hosea 3 verses 2 and 3 says this. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a leketh of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will live with you. And the word live can be translated, and I will wait for you. He said, I'm going to wait as long as it takes for us to be in love again. The Old Testament law says that a slave, to buy a slave, and this would be basically what she was, is 30 pieces of silver. Now, you can look at it two ways, that Hosea was bargain shopping, that he was trying to get the price down. But all scholars agree that by him doing with the silver and giving grain. It was the cheapest grain there was. In other words, he said, I gave everything I had. And he said, this is all I've got. He broke himself. He bankrupted himself to buy her. He gave everything. Can't you just see the neon sign, the arrow pointing at this point going, Jesus, Jesus. This story is about Hosea and Israel, but it's really about Jesus. Because God gave it all. He gave everything he had. When he said, I will give my son for these people, he was giving it all. There's nothing left to give. There's a third thing I want us to carry home from this, is that God's love is persistent. God told Hosea not only to take an unfaithful woman and love her, but it says when she's unfaithful multiple times after the marriage, I want you to take her again. I want you to go to her again. Now, this is a theme all through the book of Hosea. Israel being unfaithful and God calling them home. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea here. I don't want you to get the idea because I'm talking about the love and forgiveness of God that sin is not important. There's whole sections that we haven't read where God is talking about the problem of sin and what sin has done to this nation, what it's done to the families and relationship with God. The whole need for Hosea to have to spend his life this way, that wasn't an easy life, was because of the sin of the people. The whole reason for all of the prophets having to go and do and live and die and suffer and be in prison was because of the sin of the people. The whole reason Jesus Christ died and came and died was because of the sin of the people. Now, if you'll read the rest of the book, you'll see plenty about the consequences and the pain that sin brings. But God keeps calling again and again and again. So when you forget him again, he's going to still be calling. When you fall back into your same old sins, he's still going to be calling. When you are broken and suffering and hit rock bottom because of the bad choices and decisions you've made, he's still going to be waiting there saying, I can bring healing. Will you come on home? You see, it's not going to be our sin. It's not going to be our bad decisions. It's not going to be our lack of trust. It's not going to be anything that will condemn us to a life, an eternity separated from God in hell. That's not what's going to do it. What's going to separate us from God is our unwillingness to trust him enough to accept his love and his grace. That's what will do it. There's another message for us too, and that's for us not to give up on other people. If he could say this to Hosea, don't give up on a woman like this, then he's saying to us, don't give up on the people in your life. To the parent here who has been forsaken by a child, an adult child, over and over and over again, don't give up. To the spouse who has been neglected, don't give up. To the friend who has been forsaken by his friends, don't give up. Keep going back. To the husband or wife who has been taken for granted, don't give up. When we reach out as Jesus did and when we forgive as Jesus does, we are never more like him. And isn't that the goal in all of it, is to be like him? Now I want to share one more closing thought here. One more part here to carry home is that God's love is power, not reward. Now, please stick with me. I don't want you to misunderstand here, and I understand how easy this would be to misunderstand. This very fact could be the missing piece of the puzzle in your life of giving your life to Christ. This one little thought here. You see, God sent Hosea to his wife while she was an adulterer, while she was unfaithful, while she owed a debt as a prostitute, while she was in slavery, before she had cleaned herself up. Hosea offered his love not as a reward for her cleaned up life, but as the power to get her out of that life. It was the power that she needed. Her life was out of control. She couldn't save herself. She was too far gone to do it herself. But it was the love of Hosea that made it possible. This is just another that flashing sign pointing to Jesus. This story is about Hosea, but it's really pointing to Jesus. Romans 5:6-8 says this. You see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous man, and that's true. Though for a good man, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. When there was no guarantee that we would respond, he died for us. When there's no guarantee that we were going to clean up our life, he died for us. When there was no promise of anybody coming to him, he still died for us. Most people think God will love them when they do everything perfect. And that's simply not true. You hear it all the time. I'll give my life to Christ. Or, I'd become a Christian, but I just got too many problems. When I get my life together, then I'm going to give my life to Christ. When you think like that, you are ignoring the greatest power in the world. If we could have saved ourselves in the first place, Jesus didn't need to come. That's why he came. We could not do it. The reformer Martin Luther wrestled with himself and wrestled with God, you might say. He said this about grace. He said, learning and understanding finally the grace and forgiveness of God was the thing that set him free from loving other things and idols and to lose his anger with God, to get rid of the anger with God. He went on and he said this. He said, the gospel of God's grace did in my heart what no law could ever do. It changed my heart. Isn't that so true? A law can keep us in line. A rule can keep us in line. But it doesn't change us. He said it was the love and the grace of God that actually changed who I was. He went on to say this. He said, the only ones who get better in the Christian life are those who know their acceptance does not depend on them getting better. You want the power to defeat, as we just spent weeks talking about the giants and winning these wars, you give your life to Christ, and then it's the love of God that's going to give you the power to beat those things. You don't do it before because you don't have the power to do it. If you're waiting to get better, to give your heart to Christ, you're waiting for something that may never, ever come. You know, we're going to sing our hymn of invitation now, and it's a great, great song that we've sung many times. These words that are right there, how marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. The man who wrote this, he was born in the 1800s, died in the early 1930s. And he wrote, I think, like 7,000 poems and hymns. And I looked, I said, there's got to be a story behind the writing of this song. And there wasn't. He was a person who just never got over how amazing God's love was. So I pray as we sing this, if it points out to you a decision you need to make, will you take care of that today? If it isn't a public decision you need to make, I pray that it'll just remind you of the scandalous love that God has for you and for me. Let's stand together and sing.